We've actually been in a series in the book of Colossians, and Colossians is actually a letter that was written by the Apostle Paul in the first century, and it was written to this new church that had started in the city of Colossae. And it wasn't started by Paul, but he was writing from prison. He was writing to encourage a group of people as if he was in quarantine. He was writing to a group of people to encourage them. And what we've been exploring is how the book of Colossians is really this book that continues to point the people of God, especially these newer people who are under persecution at times, to really focus on what our faith is all about, which is Jesus. How Jesus is the central figure. Jesus is the one that we want to orient our lives around. Now, as you probably were listening or you're reading along with this passage, and if you're someone who's not of faith or that you're someone who's new to Christianity, welcome. So glad you're here. You probably maybe you tensed up a little bit when you saw that the first kind of verse that was read was, wives, submit yourselves to your husbands as is fitting to the Lord. You were probably a little bit stunned by that. And you're probably wondering, where is this coming from? What church have I visited here? Well, to give you some context again of where we've been, because this passage comes in the middle of a letter. Now, again, it's a letter that was written in the first century. So if you can kind of get this sense then, this is not like a modern day letter that was written to modern people. It was written to an ancient community in Colossae from the Apostle Paul as this new movement of Christianity was starting. And Paul, throughout the book of Colossians, has been saying, Jesus is the center. He's the one that we should be focused on. And now we enter into this period in this letter where he's starting to give very practical advice to real people like you and me, who he's writing to in this new church that's part of this new movement. And he's trying to orient them around what is the Jesus way. Because if Jesus is the center, he's the firstborn over all creation. He's the one that we worship over Caesar, over governments, over media, over our families, over all of these other kind of things that vie to become the things that we worship or give worth to. What does it mean then? If we give greatest worth and worship to Jesus, what does it mean for us as people to be on this path, the Jesus way? Treating one another, living in this world today. This isn't some sort of faith that is simply a great idea or a philosophy, but how does it flesh out in the ways in which we live our lives? And that's why Paul writes now to a specific group of people, and he gives these instructions about what is the Jesus way. Now, it begs the question though, right? What does this ancient text have to do with us today? How in the world do we make sense of an ancient text for modern people? Well, there's something that's called the redemptive movement hermeneutic. And I'm going to talk about that here. Redemptive movement hermeneutic is, of course, the scriptures were written to a specific group, but there are principles that we extrapolate from the scriptures that relate to us today. Now, the Christian story that we believe in, that explains reality the best we can, the gospel story, the good news story is a story of how God creates the world. God creates men and women in his image. He creates the world to be beautiful and good. This is what we call creation. This is the first chapter in this story. The second chapter of that story comes shortly thereafter, which is the fall, where Adam and Eve, who were the first created humans that we believe, Adam and Eve fall into sin, and brokenness and an untethering of what happens in the world comes about. And so as a result, we live in this world where God created the world to be beautiful and good and created human beings to be made in his image. But because of sin, death has entered into our world. The fabric of the ways that we relate to each other has been torn apart. The way that the world, that nature and human beings interact with one another, the way that the world around us is full of hurricanes and catastrophes. Now, from the Christian perspective, this is how both goodness and beauty, the created way that God created everything to be good and beautiful, as well as the brokenness of the world, the shame, the hurt, the death, the sickness, the COVID pandemic, the racism, the sexism, all of these things are a result of the fall, are the result of human beings who have made choices not aligned with God's way. Now, here's what we believe though, right? As Christians, what we believe is that God sent Jesus, his son, who's God himself, but his son, a great mystery of who God is. God would send his son, Jesus, to come and live and die on our behalf. And he enters the third chapter of redemption. This way of he himself comes into the world to show us a new way of living, a new way of being. He heals the sick, he feeds the hungry, and he does this to show us that the Jesus way, that the way that God intended the world to be is now being righted by what he is doing in the world around him. Now, here's what Jesus would do, though. He would die on a cross and he would resurrect from the grave. And a new kind of way, a new kind of redemption, a new way of looking at the world that we live in, a world that is full of great beauty, but also disappointment and despair. That Jesus has come to usher in a new way of living, a new way of believing, a new way of treating one another, a new way that is much different than the cultures that we might live in and the culture that we might live, that we might be kind of juxtaposition with. And this is redemption. Now, restoration is the final chapter where we believe that all things will be made new. But we live in this in-between moment right now, this moment of redemption where the Jesus way, and you see, it's after the death and resurrection of Jesus that Paul writes this letter when this Christian movement has started. Paul is writing this letter to the people of this new church in Colossae, and he's basically trying to explain that this Jesus way, the world that we live in, the pain that we experience, the disorientation that has come from the result of our own brokenness and fallenness and sin, the ways that we choose not the way of God, but instead we choose our own ways and our own selfish proclivity. And this idea of brokenness and sin is something that touches every single kind of country and race and background. But the story of Jesus is what brings us together, is his story of love and sacrifice on our behalf in a great testimony of love, and his resurrection, which tells us that a new world is coming, a new way is being ushered in. You see, this is the story that Paul is writing to the church in Colossae about. There's this new way of treating one another. There's this new way of living. There's this redemptive way. And so we can take the ancient text that he writes to the church in Colossae, and we can extrapolate what is the redemptive principles that are being taught in these scriptures that apply to us today. And so we come to this passage then, right, where here's what Paul says. He starts out, he says, wives, submit yourselves to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Now, again, if you're someone who you chafe at that kind of notion, or if you're someone who responds to that with a feeling of like, that feels really restrictive. Again, here's what Paul is doing. He's writing to ancient marriages of the people in Colossae at that time. And he's basically saying, wives, this is how I want you to behave and to react and to honor and to love your husbands, is to submit to them. Now, here's the thing. Most in that culture would simply just stop there. You see, because back then in an ancient world, the letter that Paul was writing to an ancient people, of course, women were so demeaned. They were incredibly disadvantaged. But notice what Paul does here. See, the revolutionary thing is not that Paul is writing, wives, submit yourselves to your husbands, it's fitting to the Lord. You see, the revolutionary part comes in the second part where he says, husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh toward them. Now, in other writings of Paul that you'll see in the letters that he writes to the early church, and many historians have remarked about this, the liberation of women, the uplifting of women, the way that men and women are treated with equality and dignity. This is actually a Christian principle, the uplifting of women. You know, last night was a historic moment, again, wherever you stand politically, but for Kamala Harris to be up there. And I was shaken. I started taking video of watching my daughter, my wife, kind of watch her give her speech. And as she was saying, I'm the first woman to break through this ceiling, but I won't be the last, you know? And our 4-year-old, she kind of raised her, we were eating popsicles at the time. She raised her popsicle as that was said. And I don't know if she knew what was happening, but it was just this moment of like, wow, this is really amazing. Now that principle though of equality, that even today's world where women are so demeaned and treated without dignity, oftentimes, and the whole Me Too movement was really a referendum on kind of the ways that women are demeaned. And yet it's the Christian principle of equality in the image of God in both men and women that has always been what's championed the movement for women and the liberation of women and the rights of women. Now, there's a whole lot of other things in the Christian faith and the church that's been demeaning and been I think, a very poor manifestation and representation of Christian faith. However, as you see from this passage, Paul is trying to churn the norms upside down, and he's basically saying, women, this is what I want you to submit yourselves, to serve, to love. But husbands, this is what I want you to do, to love the way Jesus loved, to love in such a manner that he would die for someone. Husbands, I want you to love and serve in that way. Love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. Now, do you see what Paul is doing? He's basically writing to real people. He's saying, the principle that I want you to live with is I want you to live the Jesus way. The Jesus way. The way that looks different than the world that we live in. Now, this becomes even more explosive if we go to the next slide here. This passage, he talks to slaves. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when your eye is on you and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Now, some people might say, see, the Bible is talking about slavery and is kind of a mandate for slavery. And here's, like, history shows us that the movements towards the abolition of slavery actually came as a Christian movement. Now, why is that the case? Because every single time Paul and others might talk about slavery in the scriptures, it's always talking about it in a manner that would bring far more liberation to slavery rather than enslavement. So in the letters of Paul, whenever you read him writing about slavery, he's always writing with an eye towards liberation, of slavery being reframed in a way of the rights of slaves, and a reframing of even slavery. So, and again, this is why the abolition movement would always have this redemptive movement in the way that they read scriptures, was because we can read this passage and say, like, see, what Paul is trying to do is he's trying to uplift the people that were in bondage of slavery. And what he basically says is, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs, and there is no favoritism. See, what Paul is basically doing is he's essentially reframing the way that slaves relate to masters, and in other passages where masters would relate to slaves. And it's always in, like, for instance, in the book of Philemon, he talks about how a master is to treat his slave like a brother, like someone who's part of the family. Now, again, these ways that Paul is writing, he's writing to a particular people in an ancient time, and he's giving these principles of the Jesus way. The Jesus way is a way in which we treat each other with dignity, respect, and honor, and truthfulness and integrity. These are the ways. You know, as I was reading this passage earlier this week, as I was even reflecting on that passage about wives and husbands, there was a moment this past week where, you know, Tina and I, we just moved. As some of you know, we just moved, which is an awful experience. You know, we're in the midst of homeschooling as well, or I should say Tina's handling most of the duties of homeschooling. We're also trying to get this building prepped up and ready to be used for mission and ministry. And so as a result, we've just had a lot of conflict. You know, our marriage has been going through more conflicts than normal with the move, the building, homeschooling. Also, if you haven't heard, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. And also this past week with the election, I just wasn't sleeping very much. And so there was one day where we got into a conflict, and I was unduly harsh with Tina. And we had a big conflict. And you know, there was a part of that I was so angry at her, and I really wanted her to know it. And I really wanted, if she could just understand all the stress that I'm under. And this is why I'm watching, you know, the news all the time. No. But you know, there was a part of me that really wanted, I wanted her to understand me, and to apologize first, and to tell her that I was the best husband ever, and that I was the best dad ever, and that she was sorry for, you know, for not saying that. And I read this passage, and, you know, the passage is clear that the Jesus way has always been a way. It's been counter to our broken, sinful proclivities, the ways in which I want my way and I want to be the right one, be the powerful one, be the one who in our marriage wins. And yet, here I was readying myself for this path where it says, husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them, Oh, man. Because this is what Jesus calls us to. He calls us not to live for ourselves, but to live with him at the center of the throne. Now, I've shared these charts before, and some of this might not be new for some of you, but if you can even imagine in your relationships, in your work, in the ways that you approach life, how many of us, our lives look like this next slide? It's a slide that basically shows a self-directed life. Ourselves are on the throne. And like me in that argument with Tina, I want to be the right one. I want to be the one who has all the power. And yet there's Jesus who's kind of outside even the circle and all my desires. And so as a result, I'm living the self-directed life. And see, when Paul gives these very practical kind of examples to wives, to husbands, to children, to fathers, to those who are in slavery, what he's doing is he's basically saying, no, I want you to reorient your life, not to the self-directed life, but to the Christ-centered life, the life in which Jesus is on the throne. And when Jesus is on the throne, it doesn't simply mean my mind is changing, but my behaviors, the way that I go about in the world, the way that I want what's best for me and my own, but instead I become a person who hopefully lives into the Jesus way, the Jesus ethic that looks very different than the world, that looks to care and out of care and concern and voting for those who are the most marginalized and oppressed. The way that we kind of have a view towards integrity and truth-telling, not only with our words, but with our body and sex, that we're a people who live the Jesus way. Now, some of you might be wondering, though, like, all right, Drew, well, gosh, this is a hard challenge. But what is the Jesus way? And why in the world should I do it when I feel like I'm getting along just fine? My job is pretty secure. I make enough money. Well, see, what it means to follow the Jesus way, it doesn't actually mean, see, you better change your behavior and do better, because that would simply be moralism. That would simply be a religious system that in many ways the world kind of abides by, a system that is basically a meritocracy. You give what you get and you get what you give. And yet the Jesus way is absolutely different. It's different because there's this fundamental word called grace, and this fundamental word of sacrificial love that Jesus embodies and lives, that gives us the very basis of the Jesus way. You see, Paul would write about this in another letter that he would write to the church in Philippi. Check out what he writes. He says, in your relationship with one another, and this is so beautiful, look what he writes. In relationship with, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself. See, the Jesus way is a way of humility by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. You see, Jesus is the author of the Jesus way. And he's the one who embodies for us what sacrificial love is, that he would humble himself, even to death, death on a cross, so that you might live and flourish. And it's that way, the Jesus way, that after we have been captured by a God like that, a God of infinite sacrificial love and beauty and grace, he calls us to be a people who also follow this Jesus way. And so the invitation for you and for me today is, if there be any part in us that somehow is missing the Jesus way, That today, that we would come and we would say, Jesus, forgive me and lead me in your path, in your ways. Maybe you are a wife or a spouse, or maybe you are a husband, or maybe you're a child, or maybe you're an employer, or maybe you're an employee in some capacity. And today, there's the call to live the Jesus way, an invitation to have him take the center, the throne of your life, and to surrender to him and to say, Jesus, lead me in your way on this redemptive, Jesus-centered path. And to realize that it's not because God does it in this top-down way, like you better do this or else, but instead he does it as by sending his son to show us the way.